The Last Zeppelin, a short story by Sven Fuglgesang. Chapter 1, November 1928. The Leviathan in the Woods.
The rain did not fall in the Black Forest. It besieged it. Commander Hugo Eckenhart leaned his forehead against the cold glass of the 8-cylinder Mercedes-Benz limousine. Outside, the ancient pines were mere charcoal smudges against a sky that had forgotten the sun. He adjusted the collar of his leather flight jacket, the worn hide a familiar comfort against the damp chill that seemed to seep through the car's very floorboards.
"Almost there, Herr Kommandant," the driver muttered, his voice barely audible over the rhythmic thrum of the heavy engine and the splash of mud against the wheel wells.
Hugo didn't answer. He was thinking of 1917, of the smell of castor oil and the stuttering rhythm of a Spandau machine gun. He had spent his youth chasing ghosts in the clouds, and now, 10 years after the armistice, he was being summoned into the dark heart of the woods for a project that didn't officially exist. The car slowed as a pair of massive iron gates emerged from the gloom. Soldiers in gray overcoats, their faces obscured by the brims of their caps, checked the driver's papers with a cold, mechanical efficiency. There were no salutes here, only the grim business of secrecy.
They drove for another mile until the trees suddenly vanished. Hugo sat upright, his breath hitching. In the center of a vast, artificial clearing stood a structure that defied the natural order. It was a colossal hangar, a cathedral of corrugated steel and rivets, glowing with a soft, unnatural light from within. He had seen similar hangars at Frankfurt Zeppelin Airport. The doors were beginning to groan open, spilling a brilliant sapphire-hued radiance onto the wet earth. "My God," Hugo whispered. As the car came to a halt, a figure stepped forward from the light. Admiral von Schreck looked exactly as he had a decade ago, a pillar of Prussian discipline, his monocle catching the blue glare of the hangar.
"Eckenhart," the Admiral barked as Hugo stepped out of the car. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Don't go soft on me now. The future is waiting inside." They walked into the hall, and for a moment Hugo felt as though he had stepped off the surface of the earth. Suspended in the massive cradle of the hangar was the LZ-128, a giant Zeppelin. He had commanded some of the test flights with the LZ-127, named Graf Zeppelin, the famous airship that just crossed the Atlantic 1 month ago and which was planned to circumnavigate the Earth next year. LZ-128 was a behemoth, even bigger than the brand-new LZ-127 and bigger than any ship Hugo had ever commanded. On the top of the ship he could see 2 heavy machine guns. Her silver skeleton gleamed, but it wasn't the size of the ship that commanded the eye. It was something in the heart of the ship. Inside the ship, located in a transparent housing, was a rotating sphere of obsidian-like metal, surrounded by a halo of crackling blue energy that could be seen in a strange diamond-shaped device on the underside of the ship.
"The zero-point engine," a voice chirped from the shadows. A man with frantic, unkempt hair and spectacles thick as jar-bottoms scurried forward. This was Major Sven von Vogel. He didn't offer a hand. He pointed toward the glowing sphere with the pride of a father. "She doesn't just fly, Commander. She vibrates with the fundamental frequency of the universe. Unlimited range and a total energy suppression for any craft within a 2-mile radius. We have rendered the internal combustion engine obsolete before lunch."
And the medical implications? Hugo turned to see a woman standing near the gondola. She wore a white lab coat over a sharp silk dress, her dark hair pinned back with clinical precision. Her eyes, however, were not cold. They were sharp with intelligence and a hint of something Hugo couldn't quite place, perhaps caution. "Commander Eckenhart, meet Dr. Rosanne von Helmstedt," the Admiral said. "Our Chief Medical Officer and Safety Liaison. She is here to ensure the zero-point field doesn't scramble your brains." "A pleasure, Doctor," Hugo said, actually meaning it. "Is it?" Roseanne asked, her voice a calm alto. "We are playing with forces that have no name in our language, Commander. I suggest we keep the pleasantries for when we've successfully landed." Beside her stood a man Hugo recognized immediately, Holger Ranning, his old wingman. Holger gave a subtle, sharp nod, the look of a man who knew they were heading into a storm but was glad to be flying with a friend. "The crew is assembled. The fuel cells are primed," von Schreck announced, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Germany was humiliated at Versailles, Hugo, but tonight we move beyond borders. We move beyond the world itself."
Hugo looked back at the LZ-128, the blue light of the engine reflected in his eyes. For the first time in 10 years, the old ace felt the familiar, terrifying rush of the hunt. He didn't know where they were going, but as he looked at Roseanne, who was watching him with a curious, guarded expression, he knew he was ready to find out. "Let's see what she can do," Hugo said. The Leviathan hummed in response, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the very marrow of his bones. The secret experiment was ready.
Chapter 2. The Tear in the Sky. The ascent was not like any flight Hugo had ever experienced. Usually a Zeppelin rose with a gentle, buoyant grace, a slow parting from the earth. The LZ-128, however, felt as if it were being repelled by the ground itself. Inside the gondola, the air tasted of ozone, sharp, metallic, and cold. Hugo stood at the primary control helm, his hands steady on the wheel, though the strange, high-pitched hum of the zero-point engine made the very rivets of the floorboards vibrate beneath his boots. "Altitude 500 meters and climbing," Holger reported from the navigator station. His voice was professional, but Hugo could see the tight grip his old friend had on the edge of the brass console. "Steady as she goes, Holger," Hugo replied. He glanced at the bank of instruments. They were custom-built, many featuring the glowing vacuum tubes of Sven von Vogel's design. "Major, how is the core holding?" Sven was hunched over the engine monitoring station, his face illuminated by the eerie sapphire glow of the obsidian sphere visible through the reinforced floor ports. "The resonance is stabilizing. We are approaching the threshold. The zero field is generating a localized gravitational slipstream. It's beautiful, Hugo, simply beautiful." Roseanne stood near the rear of the cabin, observing the crew with a medical kit strapped to her hip. She wasn't looking at the instruments, she was looking at the men. "Heart rates are elevated across the board," she noted, her voice cutting through the mechanical thrum. "Major, the air pressure is fluctuating in a way that shouldn't be possible in a pressurized cabin. Explain." Sven didn't look up. "Spatial compression, Doctor. A minor side effect of the folding metric. Pay it no mind." Hugo frowned. He felt a sudden sharp pressure behind his eyes. On the specialized Nipkow device, a circular screen that displayed a flickering mechanical television feed from the ground, Admiral von Schreck's face appeared. The image was grainy, composed of thousands of scanning lines, but his expression was one of raptor-like focus. "Commandant, you are approaching the designated coordinates," von Schreck's voice crackled through the radio. "Commence the full-phase ignition." "Acknowledged, Admiral," Hugo said. He looked at Sven. "Major, the floor is yours." Sven reached for a heavy lever encased in a lead-glass shroud. "Initiating the zero-point singularity in 3, 2, 1.
He threw the lever. The world didn't just shake, it inverted. A sound like 1,000 glass bells shattering at once filled the gondola.
Outside the panoramic windows, the night sky vanished. The darkness of the forests below them was replaced by a swirling vortex of white fire and violet clouds. The LZ-128 groaned, the duralumin frame twisting under forces it was never designed to endure. "Hugo, look at the engine!" Holger shouted. The obsidian sphere was no longer rotating. It was vibrating so fast it appeared to be in 3 places at once. A glitch, a jagged black crack in the blue light flickered across the core. "It's just a phase shift," Sven yelled over the roar of the atmospheric displacement. "Hold the course!" But Hugo felt the ship scream. It was a psychic wrenching, a feeling of being pulled through a needle's eye. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the violence ceased. The LZ-128 leveled out. The roar vanished, replaced by a silence so absolute it was deafening. "Report," Hugo gasped, his lungs burning. We're still here," Holger whispered, staring out the window. The sky was no longer black. It was a sickly, bruised purple, draped with heavy, stagnant clouds that looked like curdled smoke. Below them, a coastline was recognizable, but the cities were wrong. Instead of the twinkling lights of 1928 Europe, there were some strange high buildings like black monoliths piercing the clouds. Hugo had never seen such architecture before. "Admiral? Come in, Admiral," Hugo called into the radio. Static hissed, then the Nipkow screen flickered. Von Schreck's image returned, but it was distorted, as if seen through deep water. "Eckenhart, we've lost your signal on the radar. You disappeared from the sky. All we see is a hole in the air where the ship was." "Admiral, something has gone wrong," Hugo said, his eyes fixed on the hellish landscape below. "The world, it isn't Germany anymore. Some things look familiar, but others I can't recognize." "Stay calm, Commander," Von Schreck's ghostly voice commanded. "Find out where you are. Get in contact with anyone you can. That is an order." Hugo looked at Roseanne. She was pale, her hand resting on the glass of the window. "Hugo," she whispered, pointing down. "Look at the flags." Hugo adjusted his binoculars. Flying from the tops of the black towers were banners he had never seen in any history book. They weren't the colors of the Republic or the old Empire. They featured a stylized, slit-eyed reptilian skull in blood red. "Major," Hugo said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone, "what did you do to us?" Sven was staring at his gauges, his hands trembling. The engine didn't fail. It worked. It worked too well." Chapter 3. The Scales of Power. The descent was a slow, agonizing crawl through a sky that felt heavy, as if the very air were saturated with lead. Hugo kept the LZ-128 masked within the thick, stagnant cloud layer, using the ship's altitude to survey the nightmare below. "The resonance is holding, but the atmospheric composition is a little bit different," Sven muttered, his eyes glued to a spectrometer. "Higher sulfur content, excessive carbon. It's as if they've turned the entire planet into a furnace. Maybe they do it with these black monoliths." Hugo ignored him, his eyes fixed on the city through the bridge's forward glass. It looked a little bit like Munich, or at least the bones of it. The Frauenkirch's iconic twin domes still stood, but other buildings didn't look familiar. Far away was a gigantic lake. That was maybe the coastline they saw before. "We need to go down," Hugo said. "We can't learn anything from 2,000 meters." "Hugo, if we land that ship, we might as well light a flare for every one of those things," Holger cautioned, gesturing toward the reptilian banners snapping in the soot-stained wind. "We'll land in the outskirts. The forest on our left should still provide enough cover for a ship of this size, if we vent the ballast correctly," Hugo decided. Holger, Roseanne, you're with me. Major, you stay with the ship. If that engine so much as coughs, I want to know about it. The landing was a feat of nerves. Hugo brought the Leviathan down into a clearing of scorched gray trees. The ground wasn't the soft loam of the Black Forest, but a crust of dry ash. Once the ship was secured, the trio stepped out into the biting air. They wore their heavy flight coats, the collars turned up, and civilian caps pulled low to hide their faces. Hugo felt the weight of his Luger in his pocket, a small comfort against a world that felt fundamentally hostile.
"The silence," Roseanne whispered, clutching her medical bag. "There seemed to be no birds, no insects." In the distance, the low industrial thrum of the city provided a constant vibrating heartbeat. They hiked toward a cluster of low buildings, a village that had once been a prosperous suburb. Now it was a labor camp. A high iron grid fence, topped with glowing wire, surrounded a series of concrete barracks. As they approached the perimeter, hiding behind the rusted remains of a steam tractor, they saw them. The people were shuffling in a line toward a massive refinery pipe. They were dressed in rags, their skin a sickly, translucent gray from lack of sunlight. But it was the guards that made Hugo's blood turn to ice. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, the sentries were thick-bodied and covered in fine olive-drab scales. They wore a mix of German, French, and British uniforms with the red skull symbol on it and carried sleek black rifles. Their heads were elongated, with slit-pupiled eyes that darted with predatory precision. One of them flicked a long, forked tongue into the air, tasting the scent of the soot. "Reptiles," Holger hissed, his hand white-knuckled on his holster. "They really are reptiles." "Hush," Hugo commanded. They waited until a guard moved to the far end of the fence, then crept toward a section of the grid where a lone human was kneeling, digging at the ash with a rusted trowel. He was old, his back bent into a permanent curve. "You," Hugo whispered through the wire. The old man froze. He didn't look up immediately. "Go away," he rasped in German, though the dialect was stunted, strange. "The masters have sharp ears. If they see you without a collar, they'll skin you for the tanneries." "We are not from here," Roseanne said, her voice soft and urgent. "Please, we need to know what happened. What are those flags? Who are the masters?" The old man finally looked up. His eyes were milky with cataracts, but a spark of ancient terror flickered in them. He looked at their clean clothes, their healthy skin, and his jaw dropped. "You wear the old colors," the man breathed, looking at the small imperial eagle on Hugo's jacket button. "The ghosts of 1916 have come back to haunt the scales." 1916? Hugo asked. "What happened then?" The old man leaned closer to the wire, his voice a terrified tremor. "The Great War. It didn't end with a treaty. It ended with a harvest. The things from the stars. They had been under us for 1,000 years, wearing our skins, sitting in our parliaments. In the middle of the fire and the gas, they stopped pretending. They took the Kaiser. They took the king. They took everyone." A sharp, barking sound erupted from the guard tower, a guttural, hissing language that sounded like dry leaves skittering over stone. "Run!" the old man hissed, shoving himself away from the fence. "The reptiles are coming. They felt your engines ripple. Run, you fools!" High above, the bruised clouds parted. A trio of double-decker warplanes with the reptilian badge banked toward the forest where the LZ-128 lay hidden. Chapter 4. The Shadow of 1916. The old man's words hung in the sulphurous air like a death sentence. Hugo felt a cold sweat prickle his neck, not from the heat of the nearby refinery, but from the realization that his entire history, the war he had bled for, the peace he had sought,
was a lie in this world. 1916, Hugo repeated, his voice barely a whisper. The year of the psalm, the year of Verdun. The year of the great harvest, the old man corrected, his eyes darted toward the guard tower. They didn't come from the stars, not exactly. They came from a cloud, from the folds between what we see and what is. Some had been here for decades, wearing the faces of our politicians, our industrialists, maybe our kings. When the world was drowning in mud and gas, they simply stopped pretending and took over. Hugo thought of the way Europe had been drawn into the Great War. Had this also been manipulated in his world? To imagine some politicians or military leaders calculating men as reptilian mimics made a sickening kind of sense. They needed a war to weaken us, Roseanne said, her medical mind already dissecting the strategy. A global fever to break our immune system before the infection took hold. Exactly, little doctor, the man rasped. And now they look for more. They are building a great new device near the city center. They say they found a resonant frequency from another world, a world where the sun still shines and the air is sweet. Your world.
Hugo's heart hammered against his ribs. The 0-point engine. It wasn't just a drive, it was a dinner bell. By tearing his way into this reality, Sven had built a bridge that the reptiloids could now use to march into 1928 Germany. We have to... A sharp digital chirp erupted from the guard tower. A searchlight, emerald and blinding, swept across the ash heap, pinning them against the rusted tractor. Intruders, non-collared biosigns, a voice boomed, translated through a guttural mechanical vocoder. Run! Hugo bellowed. They jumped hastily from the fence just as a hot steel fire whizzed through the air, punctuating the iron grating on which they had been standing seconds before. From the clouds, the 3 warplanes dived with their engines roaring. Cover! Holger screamed, shoving Roseanne toward a concrete drainage pipe. The machine gun bullets struck the ground like lightning. The small explosions hurled concrete and earth upwards. Hugo saw Holger fly backwards, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Holger! Hugo scrambled through the soot, grabbing his friend by the webbing of his vest. I'm fine! Go! Holger gasped, his face white with agony. A jagged piece of shrapnel had shredded his flight trousers, leaving a blackened wound across his thigh. Roseanne was there in an instant, her hands steady despite the chaos. She didn't scream, she went to work. She jammed a morphine syringe into Holger's hip and wrapped a pressurized tourniquet around the wound. Hugo, we can't carry him through the woods, not with those things above us, she cried. We don't have a choice, Hugo said, drawing his Luger. He knew the 9mm rounds would likely bounce off the reptiloid planes, but he needed the weight of the steel in his hand. Holger, get on my shoulder. Roseanne, stay low and lead the way. They moved with the desperate clumsiness of the hunted. Above them, the reptiloid fighters circled like vultures, scanning through the gray smog. A squad of ground troops, the olive-scaled soldiers, burst from the refinery gates, their clawed feet thudding rhythmically on the ash. There, the clearing, Roseanne pointed. The LZ-128 loomed ahead, a silver ghost in the purple twilight. Its engines were already humming, a low-frequency growl that made the air shimmer. Sven was standing on the gondola's boarding ramp, waving a signal flare like a madman. Get aboard! Get aboard! Sven screamed. The hull is taking on a static charge. They have detected us. Hugo heaved Holger up the ramp, his own lungs burning from the sulfur. As Roseanne scrambled inside, Hugo turned back. A reptiloid soldier emerged from the tree line, its slit eyes glowing with a cold, predatory hunger. It raised its rifle. Hugo fired 3 shots. The bullets sparked off the creature's uniform chest plate, but the impact staggered it just long enough. Seal the hatch, Hugo yelled, diving inside as the ramp hissed shut. Ascend, maximum pitch. The LZ-128 didn't just rise, it leapt.
The zero-point engine roared into a higher octave, and for a moment the world outside was nothing but a blur of green flak and purple clouds. They were back in the sky, but they were no longer alone.
Chapter 5. The Ultimate Choice. The interior of the LZ-128 was a cacophony of medicinal smells and the high-pitched whine of overstressed engines. In the small infirmary ward, Roseanne worked with a grim, silent intensity. The machine gun had left Holger's leg with a mess of charred fabric and blistered skin. "You're lucky," she muttered, tying off a fresh bandage. The heat cauterized the vessels. If it had been an inch higher, you would have bled out before we hit the clouds. "Lucky," Holger rasped, his face drenched in sweat. "I'll remember that when I'm trying to run again." Hugo stood in the doorway, his gaze shifting from his wounded friend to the panoramic windows. Outside, the sky was thick with the gathering shadows of the reptilian fleet. Hundreds of enemy warplanes, airships, and other strange flying objects were banking toward the shimmering energy rift that hung in the sky like a jagged wound. Did Hugo just see a prehistoric pterosaur with guns on his back? "Commander, the Nipkow device," Sven's voice echoed from the bridge, sounding more panicked than usual. Hugo hurried to the cockpit. The circular screen was a blizzard of gray static, but a familiar shape was struggling to form. It was Admiral von Schreck, but the man Hugo saw was a ghost. The image flickered violently, the scanning lines barely holding together. "Hugo, do you hear me?" The Admiral's voice was thin, distorted by the friction of two dimensions rubbing against each other. "We hear you, Admiral. We've seen them. The reptilians. They're assembling a fleet. They're going to follow us back." The image of von Schreck grew momentarily clearer. The Admiral was standing in the cockpit of another Zeppelin. In the background, Hugo could see soldiers preparing machines and guns. "We see it too," the Admiral said, his voice heavy with a terrible weight. "A shadow is forming in the sky above the forest, a ripple in the air. Our scouts report thermal signatures that defy logic. If they come through, Hugo, we have nothing that can stop them. Germany, the UK, the Americans will be a fighting an armada of evil, and we are not prepared." Sven leaned into the frame, his eyes wide behind his spectacles. "Admiral, the zero-point engine is the anchor. My calculations show that the gate is stable and remains open. We are the beacon leading them to our doorstep." A long silence followed, filled only by the hiss of interdimensional static. "Then there is only one way," von Schreck said. Hugo could see the Admiral's hand trembling as he adjusted his monocle. "Major von Vogel, can the gate to our universe be closed?" Sven gasped. "Admiral, that gate is a kind of zero-point singularity. If we detonated something near the core, while on our side of the rift, the feedback loop would collapse the gate. It would be like slamming a door so hard the frame shatters." "But we'd be on the wrong side of the door," Hugo said quietly. "Yes," the Admiral replied. "You would be stranded, with no gate to return, no way back. You would be lost in that nightmare world." "The crew has to vote," Hugo said. He gathered them in the center of the gondola, beneath the pulsing blue light of the engine. Holger leaned against a support strut, his face pale but his eyes clear. Sven looked at his instruments, his hands shaking. Roseanne stood with her arms crossed, her gaze unwavering. "If we do this," Hugo began, "we save our world. We save every person we've ever known. But we stay here. We stay in the dark." Holger was the first to speak. "I've spent my life fighting for a few miles of mud in France, Hugo. This, saving the whole damn race, it's a better bargain than I ever got in the trenches. I'm in." Sven looked at the engine, his life's work. "I brought this shadow upon us," he whispered. "It is only right that I am the one to pull the trigger. I'm in." Hugo turned to Roseanne.
She stepped forward and placed a hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, the only thing in this universe that felt real. "I'm a doctor, Hugo. My job is to preserve life. If our staying here means billions of lives are saved, then there is no other choice." Hugo turned back to the Nipkow screen. "Admiral, prepare the history books. Tell them the LZ-128 didn't crash. Tell them we're still flying." Von Schreck's image began to dissolve into a final storm of static. "You are the last Zeppelin, Hugo. Save humanity." The screen went black. Hugo gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He looked at the gathered fleet of the reptilian empire and pushed the throttles to the firewall. The LZ-128 turned its nose towards the heart of the storm. Chapter 6: The Last Zeppelin. The LZ-128 was no longer a ship of exploration. It was a silver bullet aimed at the heart of a god. As they neared the rift, the purple sky erupted in green fire. The first reptilian warplanes were closed and started to prepare to attack in swarms. You could already hear their machine guns even when they were still out of range. "Sven, prepare the bomb!" Hugo shouted over the roar of the engines. "Prepared. The bomb is ready to be released on a balloon, giving us enough time to escape. And I have another idea. I will create a zero-point energy impulse that should absorb enemy energy." Sven yelled back, his fingers dancing across the controls. The ship groaned. The interior lights flickered and died, leaving the crew bathed only in the pulsing, angry blue radiance of the engine core. Suddenly, a massive shockwave rippled outward from the Zeppelin. It wasn't an explosion of fire, but a distortion of space itself. The nearest reptilian warplanes crumpled like paper as the zero-point impulse short-circuited their flight systems. "We're clear for the moment," Holger called out, gripping his station despite the agony in his leg. "The rift is dead ahead." The gate was a swirling vortex of white and violet, a tear in the fabric of the universe. Beyond it, for a fleeting second, Hugo saw a glimpse of home, the dark rain-washed pines of the Black Forest and the warm yellow lights of the hangar. It looked like heaven. "Deploy the balloon bomb," Hugo commanded, his voice thick. Sven hit the release lever. From the belly of the Zeppelin, a tiny bomb filled with a concentrated zero-point mixture drifted on a balloon toward the center of the vortex. It looked so fragile against the scale of the cosmic tear. "Now, Sven, detonate it," Hugo whispered. Sven turned a final dial. "Goodbye, old friends," he whispered. A blinding flash of white light consumed the bridge. There was no sound, only a sensation of immense, crushing weight, as if the universe were folding in on itself. The LZ-128 was tossed like a leaf in a hurricane, the duralumin frame screaming in protest as the gate began to snap shut. Then, silence. The violent shaking stopped. The white light faded. Hugo opened his eyes to see a sky that was no longer violet, but a heavy, unchanging slate gray. The swirling vortex was gone. In its place was nothing but empty air and the distant, jagged silhouettes of the reptilian towers and cities. Hugo looked at the Nipkow screen. It was dead. The bridge of energy to 1928 had been severed. Did we do it?" Roseanne asked, her hand trembling on Hugo's shoulder. Sven checked a single remaining gauge powered by an emergency battery. The resonance is gone. The gate is sealed. On both sides. Hugo let out a breath he felt he had been holding for lifetimes. They were alive, but they were ghosts. Somewhere, across a distance that could no longer be measured in miles, Admiral von Schreck was looking at an empty sky, and the world was safe, at least for some time. "Commander," Holger said, pointing toward the horizon, "reptilian warplanes and zeppelins are approaching us. An armada of enemy ships is rising in far distance. They are slow, but they are coming for the ship that dared to close their door." Hugo looked at his crew. They were exhausted, wounded, and stranded in a nightmare. But as he looked at Roseanne's defiant gaze and Holger's steady hand on his holster, he felt a new kind of fire. "We can't go home," Hugo said, turning the wheel to bank the ship away from the approaching fleet and toward the dark, unexplored reaches of the occupied Alps. "But we aren't finished. We have the only ship in this world that they can't track and can't control. We have an engine with unlimited energy." He looked out at the enslaved world below. "We are the Last Zeppelin," Hugo declared, his voice ringing with a new purpose. "Holger, find us a place to hide. Roseanne, prep the medbay." The LZ-128 vanished into the clouds, a lone silver spark against the encroaching dark. The 0-point war had only just begun.